The US has ended its longest war. Its hasty withdrawal from Afghanistan has been criticized by the world at large. The Taliban now rule Afghanistan and are set to announce their new government soon. So what will happen to the Afghans? Will the US offer any aid to the country that it once promised to safeguard? Welcome to WION World is One. My name is Priyanka Sharma and this is our special weekly broadcast of the WION VOA co-production, where we look at some of the biggest stories coming from America. Now, the U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin was the first cabinet member to take questions from reporters since the end of America's longest war. He was joined at a Pentagon briefing on Wednesday by the top U.S. general. As VOA Pentagon correspondent Carla Babb reports, the U.S. isn't completely done with Afghanistan yet. More details in the next report.
Pride, pain, and anger on display at the Pentagon Wednesday, 2 days after the last U.S. troops left Afghanistan.
Now, we have just concluded the largest air evacuation of civilians in American history. It was heroic. It was historic.
War is hard. It's vicious. It's brutal. It's unforgiving. And yes, we all have pain and anger. And when we see what has unfolded over the last 20 years and over the last 20 days, that creates pain and anger.
A State Department official admitting Wednesday that in addition to more than 100 American citizens left behind, a, quote, majority of special immigrant visa applicants were also not evacuated, a group consisting of Afghans who helped the United States and their families. The Taliban again control Afghanistan, with General Mark Milley acknowledging the U.S. might need to coordinate with them further.
This is a ruthless group from the past. And whether or not they change remains to be seen. And as far as our dealings with them at that airfield or in the past year or so, in war, you do what you must in order to reduce risk to mission and force, not what you necessarily want to do.
Any possibility of coordination against ISIS-K with them?
It's possible.
Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin vowed revenge against the Islamic State Afghanistan affiliate at a time of America's choosing. The terror group staged a suicide attack against Kabul's airport in the last days of the withdrawal, killing 13 U.S. service members and at least 170 others. The Taliban are bitter enemies of the Islamic State offshoot that staged the attack, but the White House is in no hurry to pursue an alliance.
There's no rush to recognition from the United States or any country we've spoken with around the world. It will be very dependent on their behavior and whether they deliver on what the expectations are of the global community.
Expectations include letting Americans and at-risk Afghans leave and respecting the human rights of women, minorities, and journalists. Carla Babb, VOA News, The Pentagon.
To speak about this further, we're now joined by Voice of America's correspondent Amy Hybels from Washington. Amy, thanks for joining us on this special broadcast. Now, what are the Biden administration's plans to help Americans who are still stuck in Afghanistan and want to get out?
Well, the U.S. government has said that more than 124,000 civilians were evacuated from Afghanistan, and that number includes almost 6,000 Americans. But we've also learned that there are between 100 and 200 U.S. citizens still on the ground in Afghanistan, and that number does not include green card holders. Now, U.S. President Joe Biden has been criticized for ending this airlift operation before all Americans were able to leave. If you recall, in an exclusive interview with ABC News back on August 18th, President Biden said, quote, if there's American citizens left, we're going to stay to get them out. Now, on Tuesday, President Biden defended the exit, stating the bottom line, 90% of Americans in Afghanistan who wanted to leave were able to leave. And for those remaining Americans, there is no deadline. We remain committed to get them out if they want to come out. Now, at this point, the U.S. Secretary of State is in charge of the diplomatic effort to try to secure safe passage for anyone that wants to leave Afghanistan. As you know, a lot of this, Priyanka, will depend on the Taliban if they're going to follow through on those assurances that they'll allow all foreign nationals and Afghan citizens with travel documents to leave the country. To further complicate matters, of course, the airport in Kabul is closed at the moment, and the U.S. State Department says it is looking at land routes out of the country to try to assist those that want to leave.
Right, Amy, now what is the Biden administration saying about the U.S. Special Immigrant Visa Program or applicants who did not make it out during the airlift operation?
Well, sure. A senior U.S. State Department official said that the majority of them did not leave the country. And we don't have any definitive information, actually, on the number of SIV applicants who were evacuated during the huge airlift operation over the last 2 weeks in August. Now, the U.S. government has said that the evacuation efforts did not end on August 31st and that they will not end until they've secured the evacuation of any American citizens, legal permanent residents, and people who've worked with the U.S. who still want to get out of the country. Now, we're also learning a lot more about the process that was involved when it came to deciding who was allowed to enter the airport. During that mass evacuation process, a diplomatic source on the ground who spoke to VOA said rules about which individuals could evacuate were, quote, ever-changing. That meant that family members of U.S. citizens and legal permanent residents, as well as special immigrant visa applicants, may have been allowed into the airport one day, but not the next. Now, at a Pentagon briefing on Wednesday, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin talked about the SIV applicant process. He remarked that the special immigrant visa program is obviously not designed to accommodate what we just did, adding, for the type of operation that we just conducted, I think we need a different type of capability. The effort to evacuate Afghans as well as others at risk, including journalists that are still in the country, is obviously something that the press here in the U.S. will continue to follow very closely in the days ahead.
Amy, my final question on this subject. How does the U.S. plan to thwart the terrorism threat from the likes of the ISIS-K in Afghanistan without any boots on the ground?
Well, when it comes to keeping track of ISIS-K or Al-Qaeda, obviously it's going to become more difficult if they don't actually have U.S. forces on the ground or even friendly government forces that they can share intelligence with. And in fact, counterterrorism and intelligence officials who spoke with the Wall Street Journal this week say it will be much harder and less effective than the White House suggests. The White House is saying that it can contain these groups with over-the-horizon surveillance and strikes. There's also conflicting accounts emerging of that U.S. drone strike on Sunday, just a day before the U.S. troops withdrew from the country. The U.S. military said that at least one of those killed in the drone strike was an Islamic State facilitator, while the White House acknowledged reports of civilian casualties. Now, American officials, including some who watched the strike in real time on video feeds, said the U.S. had been watching the car for several hours and saw people loading explosives into the trunk. But an Afghan family says that the drone strike killed 10 of its members, including 6 children, and vehemently denied any ties to the Islamic State, according to reporting by the Associated Press. Now, analysts also warned that the risk of civilian casualties during drone strikes is only going to grow now that the U.S. no longer has on-the-ground intelligence in that country.
Amy Hybels, thank you so much for all your inputs on this story. Stay with us on this special broadcast. We'll also like you to weigh in on the weather updates coming from the U.S. Now, let's move on. Nearly 50 people have died across 5 American states as remnants of Hurricane Ida continue to wreak havoc across the country. There are now continuing calls for rescue after the storm took residents and officials by surprise. VOA's Isha Sarai has more on the devastating storm. Take a look.
The death toll in New York and New Jersey continues to rise after the remnants of Hurricane Ida caused heavy rainfall and flash floods across the region.
We saw a horrifying storm last night, unlike anything we have seen before. And this is a reality we have to face. Unfortunately, the price paid by some New Yorkers was horrible and tragic.
Most of the victims in New York City died when their basement homes were flooded. Many more reported property damage.
I feel very sad for them, but I still count myself lucky because I'm not in that bad situation. But still, it's terrible for the community here.
More drownings were reported in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Despite warnings from the National Weather Service, the strength of the storm took many by surprise. Hurricane Ida made landfall in Louisiana exactly 16 years after Hurricane Katrina devastated the U.S. Gulf Coast.
The people of Louisiana and Mississippi are resilient and resourceful. We're going to stand with you for as long as it takes to recover and allow you to rebuild.
The devastation caused by the storm across the East Coast has led many to question whether their cities are prepared for the increasingly negative effects of climate change. Isha Sarai, VOA News.
For more on this, we still have Voice of America's correspondent Amy Hybels live with us from Washington. Amy, what's the response from the White House in the wake of this natural disaster and the system in place?
Well, sure. U.S. President Joe Biden, who is here at the White House right now, is expected to leave shortly and head to the southern state of Louisiana to tour some of that storm damage. He has already pledged federal assistance to those states impacted by Hurricane Ida and by the wildfires out west. In an address from the White House yesterday, he said these storms and the climate crisis are here. We must be prepared. We need to act. Mr. Biden also says he's going to push Congress to pass his infrastructure package that would address roads, bridges, and the electrical grid here in the U.S. Now, the powerful storm that hit really caught everyone off guard. Right here, just miles from Washington, D.C., right up the road in Annapolis, we know that a tornado touched down and caused extensive damage throughout Anne Arundel County in Maryland and in Rockville, Maryland. Flash flooding actually sent rushing waters into basement apartments, and a 19-year-old resident unfortunately drowned. So just some horrific consequences from that storm. You know, what began as a hurricane that everybody was focused on the southern states of Louisiana and Mississippi ended up morphing into a storm system that traveled throughout the Northeast, impacting many states in this region, devastating infrastructure and claiming U.S. lives.
Right, Amy, thank you so much for all those inputs, and thank you for joining us on Beyond World is One. Beyond World is One is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.